In today's class, we're going to answer the questions, what the internet is, what is the World Wide Web, some terms to know, as well as talk a little bit about the future of the web, where we're heading. So let's get started by discussing protocols. Simply put, a protocol allows exchange of information between electronic items. In computing terms, it's just a set of rules that lets computers communicate with each other. A protocol says what part of the conversation comes at what time. It also says how to end the communication. Now, an internet protocol is a protocol responsible for addressing, sending, and receiving essentially the data packets that go over the internet. What we have here, we're going to be referencing this kind of cloud-looking item, and that's going to be what we call the internet. The internet often is referenced as a cloud. So the red line that connects the two of them is the internet protocol. So it's a protocol that allows computers to communicate with each other through the internet. TCP/IP oftentimes comes before IP. So a lot of times you'll hear TCP/IP. So TCP is Transmission Control Protocol. Really all this does is it shrinks the packet before it goes out and then expands it, assembles it essentially again once it arrives. So most of us know what the internet is. In its simplest form, it's just a bunch of computers all connected together sharing information. When a lot of times we don't always fully understand how we are connecting to the internet, so I thought I'd put a graph out here. Really in its basic form, we're either on a laptop, which uses a wireless connection, or on a desktop that has a hard wire, and that goes to a router. The router is connected to a modem. Oftentimes a router can also be a modem in one little box, and that connects to your internet service provider. Once you've connected to your ISP, or your internet service provider, you're essentially on the internet, and you can now have access to browse other servers that are available. The internet in its simplest form is our computer connecting to a server, right? Connecting to the cloud, connecting to files that are outside of off of our computer. Those servers can then connect to other servers that also hold files, and then they can also connect, to other computers, right? So it's this web, this huge kind of mixture of computers connected to each other, sharing information, sharing files, etc. Now, we all know that internet allows us to email, upload and download files, collaborate. It allows for information gathering, and it connects other devices, not just computers, cell phones, faxes, whatever it could all be connected through the internet. So a subset of the internet is the World Wide Web. A lot of times we see it's www, right? So the World Wide Web, really the difference of that is that it's all linked together using something called hypertext. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So if we're in our web browser, we always type in http:// and then the domain name we're looking for and then the file we're looking for. So that HTTP is simply just the protocol we're using to access that information. So an HTTP request is sent, and that's sent from your web browser. That goes to the server and says, hey, I'd like to access this file. And in a nutshell, it gets that file sent back to them. We're going to talk more about browsers in a little bit, but it'll then decode that file so we can view it like a website. The question may be, how do we get that file on the internet to begin with? Well, we use that through File Transfer Protocol. So that's FTP. If you've ever worked on a website, you may have heard, what's your FTP? I need FTP login, etc. It's just a file server on the internet, or it's a way to access your web server. So you can, from your local host, from your computer, upload a file to the web server, and once it's there, everybody can see it. FTP software, I like a program called FileZilla, but FTP software is that tool that allows you to take files and send them to the web. So, a lot of information, but let's keep calm and let's recap. In a nutshell, we use Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP, to access websites. We use the File Transfer Protocol to store and retrieve files from the internet. It's that simple. So let's reapproach this concept with maybe a little more of a tangible example. To start, if we were to make a website, to start what we would need is an HTML document. Now, an HTML document stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and this is the language of the web. We'll talk more about how to create an HTML file in a different video, but for right now, let's just assume that the file exists. The HTML file is then read by a browser. The browser's job is to essentially decode the HTML and turn it into something that's very easy for us to read and understand. Now, there are a lot of different types of browsers. There's Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and that's about it. Chrome is my favorite browser. That's what I use on a regular basis. More than likely, if you're on a Macintosh or an iOS device, you're using Safari. A new term for us to learn is hypertext. So we've all seen on websites, be able to click on a link and it takes us to the next page. That's all it is. That's considered a hypertext. The hypertext transfer protocol is really based on this idea of linking one site to another, and one page to another. The ability to call files, etc. When we look at a website, a lot of times we don't think about what goes in behind the scenes. And again, that is the source. So the browser job, like I mentioned, is to show us the website in a way that's easily consumed by us. But if we were to ever go view source on a website, we would see all the code that's typed in to actually make that site exist. So a browser interprets that in something we can see. The HTML document is made up of a few different sections. So when we create a tag, a tag is the little bracket, and then the tag name, and then the bracket closes. We always want to close the tag. So we'll notice that there's a HTML, and then there's another one that says HTML, but it has a little backslash. So that's how the tag closes. We'll also notice there's two main sections to an HTML document. The first section is head. This is all the information that's kind of behind the scenes that tells the browser what the title of the page should be, if there's any kind of scripts or any kind of additional information that it needs to serve up that's not really seen directly. The second main area that we all know is what's called the body, and the body has the content that we typically view. So we've now created these HTML files. We have them on our computer, but how do other people see them if they're just on our computer? Well, we need a web host. A web host is just a computer that's turned on, has access to the internet. A lot of times we're going to be paying for this, so it's typically a hosting provider. And that's just a web server that's has access to the internet that we can connect to and store our files on. Again, as we talked about earlier, if we want to transfer our files from our computer to the web server, we use File Transfer Protocol, or FTP. Once the files have been transferred to the web, anybody with internet access can now see them. So any computer can now see the files. But there's so many servers out there's so many different files and websites, how do we keep them all track, right? Well, the same way that we have neighborhoods and our neighborhoods have addresses, IP addresses are the address for Internet Protocol. So we may have seen, 127.0.0.1, that's essentially your local host, or 99.25.65, any of the numbers can go on. Note that multiple websites can actually share the same IP address. And when we talk about search engines, we'll talk about things like dedicated IP addresses and whatnot. But now, just to keep it simple, your website has an IP address. But nobody would use an IP address to refer to it, right? We wouldn't go run a radio ad campaign saying, visit us on the web at 127.0.0.1. We wouldn't remember it, right? So we use visit us on the web at company.com. Now, that company.com is what's called a domain name. We're all pretty familiar with this. The .com is what's called a top-level domain extension, and that refers to a commercial website. Other examples are .org for organization, .net for network, .gov for government, .edu for education, and a host of a lot of new ones that have been coming up over the years. In addition to those ones mentioned, there's also country extensions. So every country has its own. We are .us, .ca is Canada, etc., etc. So let's get back now to this idea that a domain name is really equal to an IP address in its simplest form. How does a domain name know which IP address to route to? Well, that's called domain name services, or DNS. So there's a database that essentially says, hey, if you're looking for mycompany.com, you're actually looking for this IP address. If you've ever had your webmaster say, point your DNS records over to this IP address, right? It may sound like a lot of Greek, but it's really pretty straightforward. That just says you own the domain name, you need to point what's called the A record for your website over to this IP address of the hosting account that they likely set up for you. Now, if it's your email, that's considered an MX record. So A records for websites and MX records for email. There are a lot of other ones available as well, but those are the two most common. Let's recap. Hypertext Markup Language is a language used to create a web page. A web page needs to be hosted on a server for others to see it. A domain name resolves to an IP address where the website, essentially is located, and the Internet Explorer is horrible.